Welcome to Control Alt Deploy, the podcast where we talk with AI innovators at large enterprises, the people in the trenches to learn and uncover as they're successfully shipping generative AI in the enterprise. With us today is Ian McCallum. He is an AI technical solution and strategy advisor at SAP, helping enterprise customers with guidance on AI architecture, embedded use cases, and cloud transformation. He's held many roles at SAP, and at one time, Ian literally wrote the book on testing at SAP. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Kuba. Good to see you. Hey, Alex. Good to see you as well.
Welcome, Ian. Good to have you here.
So what we want to talk about today is first, given that you see many types of customers in your role, I'd like to hear your industry perspective on how enterprises are adopting AI today. And then second, I want to zoom in. And what I'm really interested in is in your perspective and how you see testing practices, how they have had to change now that software includes generative AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big question that's changed in the last, I'll say 9 months or even year is not whether I want to deploy an AI based solution, but how I'm going to deploy that solution. And that's meant that for me, the conversation has moved from why to how. Those how questions start to include topics like governance. They include topics like security. They include topics like life cycle. And folks had not really been thinking about those in any substantive sense before that. There's also kind of a disconnect in when I have conversations with customers between what they see at home, right, with a Chat GPT or a Claude or Gemini, and what they're seeing in the office. And those differences can really be reduced to the same kind of enterprise topics that customers are beginning to realize are critical to an enterprise deployment, right? And so as we've started to see these solutions move into quality and then production, what has happened is that you're starting to see testing. And as I noticed you all had talked about in your previous episode, right, this is non-deterministic testing, right? Probabilistic testing. And so customers have had to move from, I'm going to get answer A with input X. They've now got to say, well, I can get a range of inputs, a range of solutions based on my input, and I want to ensure that they converge around a solution. Some of the more innovative customers have used generative AI to check the generative AI answers, sort of an adversarial kind of approach to it. That's not as common, but it is something that I do recommend when folks have, less maybe expertise around what they're expecting from an answer. But yeah, it's really interesting because no longer can we sort of go forward with a regression testing program. What we're looking at instead is kind of statistical testing or spot testing and ensuring that what they're getting is what they expect.
So what kind of AI systems do you see customers deploying today? Is it co-pilots? Is it conversational interfaces? Is it still, 2025 and they're still building RAG systems, or are we going full agentic?
Just at the dawn of the agent era, I feel the generative AI capabilities are helpful. And I guess 2 years ago, we would have thought they were magic, and now they look kind of quaint because as customers are starting to deploy agents, they're really beginning to see that the multiplication of the capability. But agents themselves also introduce new kinds of security concerns and therefore testing strategies. And again, what we're looking to ensure is that the agents don't go rogue or take on actions that they shouldn't, right? So we need, again, to ground this, small g ground this in the same kind of basic enterprise security, principal propagation, and ensure that agents don't get more capabilities than they should. So in that case, again, security testing becomes important for agents as well as for generative AI. Because the generative AI capabilities can get to access data that folks may or may not have access to, you've got to incorporate that in the generative AI solutions too. So really just the beginning of the agent era and a lot of new testing approaches coming up for agents as well.
What kind of use cases are you seeing for agents? What are they using them for?
Now it's a lot of automation, Alex. It's a lot of taking and that mindless work that actually is part of most enterprises that I come across, right? They get that invoice. The invoice is sometimes even handwritten, but most of the time it's a PDF document. And there's no way to effectively convert that into, let's say a transaction in an ERP system. What the agents are doing is taking those in bulk, right? Huge numbers, hundreds and thousands of these invoices, and converting them to a format that they can add to an ERP system. A lot of very beginning of the what I'll call reasoning agent that you would ask a question of and turn it loose to get some kind of insight or potentially determine an alternate, but really more on the automation side so far, beginning to see that reasoning come through with agents.
But mostly still internal workflows, right? These aren't being pushed out to the customer side yet.
Yeah, no, they're really not. Or on the customer side, I am seeing a lot of generative AI for communication, right? To send that email, to send that direct message, to send that text to a customer more than just personalized, right? It's potentially personalized, maybe timely, all kinds of different characteristics that would take time to generate. But with the generative AI, you're starting to see that getting really contacting customers, more in contact with customers. Agents less still. Again, the key in my mind to that is going to see cohorts of agents. Right now, folks have 3, 5, 10 agents, and that's manageable. Over time, we're going to start to see larger numbers of agents. That's where the whole governance, security, testing, lifecycle management is going to become critically important. As more agents become more prevalent, that's where all of these enterprise grade capabilities will become more important.
Yeah, so basically, like in the ever growing agentic team, like a construction site, right? That you have specialties because right now there's a management agent, right? And that controls a couple of sub agents that really own the task, but the complexity is going to keep growing where each of these sub agents will have a variety of tasks that they're responsible for. No reason why they can have an additional set of sub agents underneath them. Right now, mainly due to restraints in computing power and really the development side. But when the coding is also going to be done more and more by AI, a year, 2 years from now, it'll go from a handful to maybe a dozen agents to potentially hundreds, whole swarms of these processes running and doing tasks. So interesting how everything's going to be managed and secured. It not in the very distant future.
Not distant future, exactly.
But things are moving very quickly.
The interesting question I have for customers that I talk with a lot is, right now you have a small number. Imagine a situation in which you have 3 agents that do the same thing. That's going to come faster than you can imagine. And ultimately, testing is going to be critical for that. Because you have probabilistic results, you're going to need to test this again and again and again and ensure that, the right agent gets selected or that there's some differentiation between those agents. It's
Yeah. No, that's a great point.
We're not even sure what issues are going to arise
Yeah.
as we move forward.
Yeah, the probabilistic nature of it means that you can't just run one single scenario and say it does that. There's no more confirmed that it does or does not do something. It's out of X amount of iterations. How often is it sticking to its intended task or its trajectory? And how often is it veering off, hallucinating, or drifting off from what it was intended to do? It's a completely different approach and very interesting set of challenges, right? Where the number of interactions determine the amount of times it could potentially veer off as that the non-deterministic probabilistic nature It's not a bug, it's a feature, as I keep saying.
Absolutely.
What are you telling your customers or advising your customers when it comes to like how do they need to think about changing their development lifecycle?
Yeah. Can you expand on that a little?
Well, so, before it was kind of, requirements were pretty rigid or testing, inputs match outputs, development, you build to spec. Um,
Yeah.
like all of these things now change.
They do, absolutely. It's more intent now than mechanism, if that makes sense, right? So with an agent, you're able to simply say, this is the end state I want. And if it's a reasoning agent, we've talked a little bit about how we're just getting to see those. If it's a reasoning agent, then it will put together the components that need to be integrated to provide the solution, right? What that means is that you don't really design the whole start to finish workflow. And ultimately, testing, not to come back to that too often, but that testing is going to be hugely important for Kuba. You really have to, and I know this is going to sound very TDD, right? Test driven development. You really need to start with that test in mind. How will I know this is working as you begin to develop? Can't really wait, I don't think, to get to the point where I've got a deployed agent. Let's create some tests now. That really should come at the start of I think it's fascinating that potentially agents will learn over time and they will learn to avoid common errors. They will learn to avoid potential dead ends in their reasoning paths. And so it may be that if you test an agent to start with, eventually it won't drift, it might even improve. And so you'll see some improvement in the performance. But yeah, I think testing is now all the more important because you're exposing intent rather than mechanism.
Do the customers understand that? Do the people you're talking to? I'm sure they have queries about agentic systems, AI. How can I implement? Are they already at the stage where they understand or starting to understand that there's problems potential? So are they asking for testing, or do you still have to educate them?
Yeah, a lot of education, Alex. Yeah, that's it. And look, we've all been through the agile DevOps evolution, right? And there's still folks out there that say, nope, waterfall is the only way to go. And I expect that for some time, we'll still be coming across folks that don't understand the importance of testing and will deploy agents without effectively understanding what they can do or not do, as the case may be. So, yeah, it's a lot of education, and hopefully, just repeating that the importance of the testing and the life cycle management for agents is it'll yield dividends. But right now, it's a lot of the same. A lot of it's on that.
Yeah, they'll encounter the need for testing whether they like it or not, whether they test themselves and their internal teams are understanding that, or some cohort in China decides that they're going to test their systems for them, right? And this is kind of like as we saw recently, where Anthropic, right, make some claims, like the big Chinese companies started to use their AI to try to extract proprietary data and training techniques from Anthropic's models.
Right.
So it's already happening where outsiders could come in and start try to extract personal information, company proprietary information from these models. So I think testing more so than even guardrailing, because guardrails are very important, but testing is going to become the talk of the town more and more as these systems are being deployed out into production, and certainly as they start to face the wide world and client side. So it's
Absolutely.
coming whether they like it or not, and hopefully they get ahead of that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
If going back to kind of like the delta between then and now, you wrote your book quite a while ago. And if I were to summarize your book, it'd be that testing SAP applications, because that's what it's on, requires a layered automated testing strategy uh, with the goal to isolate logic, validate UI behavior, and maintain quality through continuous automated testing. So Out of that, what still holds up and what doesn't?
Yeah. Really, what drove it initially is, I think you intimated, Kuba, was a real interest in how to increase the velocity of adoption of enterprise systems, right? Customers that I talked with were continually facing issues with changing market, business strategy, whatever their business was going through. It wasn't the same as it was 6 months, a year before. And they were struggling to keep their support systems in sync with the business processes. And so what happened were lots and lots of manual steps that would get stitched back into the support systems, ERP or supply chain or whatever it might be. And so being able to automate those tests provided greater coverage, provided more certainty, and allowed them to move forward with reliable systems more rapidly, right? But as we've been talking about here, not going to be able to regression test, AI based or agentic systems because there'll be different answers. And so what is going to start to happen in my mind is that we're going to see statistical testing, the resurgence maybe of statistical testing, sampling, and providing coverage in that case. And that will provide adequate evidence that the system is reliable going forward.
So, how do we define good enough, right?
Isolate. And that will vary depending, I think, on the type of, solution. For financial solutions, that's going to be pretty tight. You don't want a 10% error when you're closing your books. But if your supply chains have a 10% variance, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. Maybe you deal with perishables, and that 10% wouldn't be acceptable. There'll be some just-in-time costs, but hopefully they'll be offset by the automation and the ability to get insight into or to eliminate some of the friction in those processes. It's going to be interesting because I in particular am a little, I think worried might be too strong a word, but if you start to think about financial agents and them closing books and that sort of thing, I haven't done the math recently, but if you have a 2 to 3% error rate over time, in the worst case, that could become a 70% success rate after several, iterations. And so it's it's easy to see how that's going to be a real challenge. And those will have to be very tightly bound, parameters for success. But then, of course, you have HITL, right? Human in the loop. And I think can't discount when you're testing that part of the process. And for financial solutions, for solutions that affect people and human beings, the human in the loop is going to be important as well.
I see that, traditionally you have red teaming, right, when it comes to testing. And red teaming is usually very security minded. And so, as an example, you click submit, typically a certain functionality comes after that. It's somewhat predictable, it's expected. And red teaming would do some penetration testing, see if you can scale up in some permissions for the existing user, increase some capability, and almost kind of like a firewall. Once you discover some path to do that, you block that hole right in that dam and it's done. But now there's really a need for more of a assurance side testing. So red teaming from a security perspective doesn't always make sense when it comes to LLMs and LLM based apps because of that probabilistic nature, where now you're clicking submit and 9 out of 10 times it's somewhat of a expected result. It's not necessarily 100% all the time the same, but that 1 out of 10 times it could be somewhat like very, very drastically different. And now you're thinking, well, do I need to click it 100 times? Do I need to click it 1,000 times? So it's like Kuba said, when is it good enough? So you're really needing to be going into the world of assurance and being able to say, okay, out of X amount of iterations, these things were discovered, and this is now a certain expectations out of a certain number of times. And we're seeing that whatever the changes are in the background, it's improving the overall risk factor, right? The overall picture. But now that before you had the human in the loop was trying to click something and discover these paths in order to break the security, what is the human now going to be doing in this loop that's now potentially almost not really even feasible for a human to achieve? I mean, a human can't really click and discover, to 10,000 different interactions with AI. Where in the loop is the human now from your perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. And it strikes me that you're not so for those scenarios, you're not going to be able to run it 1,000 times, right? You're going to run it 10 or 20, and you're going to imagine that folks will borrow from, kind of the life sciences and testing that goes on there, right? You have a target, and then you have allowable variances for that, and it's all based on statistics and the bell curve and so on, right? The normal distribution. So that's what you'll start to see. And ultimately, again, how tight that bell curve is will depend on what you're trying to get done. You inspired a thought, Alex, when you were talking about this. And, red team members are not sort of your average folks. If you want to, I think that's a nice way to say it, right? They think of ways to break things. And this is when you're working with a deterministic solution and you want to make sure you're looking for very kind of tight distribution around success. You're going to need folks that think differently, that think not how can I prove this is right, but how can I break this and show that it's wrong? That's going to be a big change, right? And that role will become more important because, again, these are non-deterministic solutions. And so you'll need to understand like where it could break and how. And those are the folks that are going to get at you through that testing, right? But again, this is a kind of a solved problem with life sciences because of the volume of testing and the sampling that they do. I see it heading in that direction, right?
Typically, speaking of red teaming, so I'm on a current soapbox here that red teaming, it's not the right term for what we're doing here. And it's been, red teaming has come through the cybersecurity folks, particularly because the chat interfaces were really attackable, right? So the whole idea with the prompt being you can steer the prompt to do something negative, right? But these applications are no longer controlled by the prompt. There's a prompt, but it's really the kind of the data plane and that's susceptible to prompt injections. Even that is such a small part of the reliability of a system where hallucinations, bias, all of these quality all of these quality things that we have to prove before we ship something to production, right? Those are not security threats. And so, long story short, when we introduced generative AI through prompt interfaces, it kind of made sense for red teaming to exist in the security apparatus of companies. And now I believe that has to move toward, I guess it's a shift left to development QA with security as just a small part of that. The question is, are you seeing that shift also in the organizations that you're helping implement these types of agents or whatnot?
Yeah, not yet. It's a little early. And I agree. That's where the shift has to go, right? This is going to be a new way of developing. Certainly foundations aren't going to change. Like you need governance, you need security, you need lifecycle management, need all of those. But I think you're right. Where you begin to ideate on how things can break has to come sooner than security, has to come sooner than the QA team, has to come sooner than, the end users, long before that point. That's where I think there becomes a role for folks that are good at breaking things. I've worked with some testers in the past that I was 100% sure that this was working. They would find within 10 minutes that interesting way to break things. So you're right. So it's expanding the development team to include those kind of folks. And changing the thinking of developers, maybe. Yeah.
Well, it seems like they've been siloed up until now
Yeah.
into their own worlds. The app dev side, the QA side is rarely coming from a personal experience, is that rarely consulted with anybody in security
Yeah.
when it came to testing out the application. Again, they're looking at the requirements, right? So it's like product management gives them the requirements, the developers build this out, and then you start to iterate back and forth with developers as you find issues that are either not according to the spec or some corner cases outside of that. Security wasn't really all of that big of a concern. I know also now from experience that the security side wasn't necessarily all that concerned with the quality of the software, as long as they couldn't
Right.
really figure out a way to red team, right? They would do their red teaming. They would see that the data is secure, the permissions are secure. They got a certain policy when it comes to limiting the set of permissions out in the, but as soon as it gets pushed out and into the hands of development, it's like, okay, we're kind of done there. We have our policies in place. We do our periodic checks, and we seem to be compliant in essence, right? But now they all have to work together continuously in order for one to understand the other's world, and then that's kind of where more specialized tooling has to be really in place, because a lot of this is not a one time and done. It's potentially thousands of interactions in order to see any fallout from the security world, right? That's relevant to them, or any kind of fallout from the development side, like a bug in the interaction between the user and the AI system, which is what QA is going to have to be capturing. And so they were segregated in a lot of ways and now have to all kind of come together. It's almost like human versus the machine type of world. And then somewhat simplistic and not really considered very much right now, but in the very far future of a year or two for now, companies aren't slowing down where their implementation of things, right? They're not really like trying to take a step back and go, well, let's not use the latest and greatest capability out there, right? Let's not take advantage of the most ROI that we can from these systems. So they're going out there, they're trying to bring these systems out into production, and 2 years from now, when there's hundreds of agents interacting with one another probabilistically, the whole entire company, in essence, is going to have to be the human in the loop in some way, because you're not going to have an AI just in the development department, just in in finance, for example. It's going to be in every department, right? Everybody is going to be in some way interacting with it for the benefit of the company. So, are people thinking about these things at like SAP, or are they thinking about it? Some of the companies that you're interacting with, are they future facing, or is it just mostly now? What are my concerns now, and not so much from a year from now?
It's the latter. What drives that? I feel like it's evolving so rapidly, Alex, that it's difficult for folks to imagine and so sure, my most thoughtful, my most advanced customers are thinking about the situation in which they have 100 agents, right? And what that's going to mean, and whether or not, they'll be able to support reliable business processes. There's a interesting idea I heard about on a podcast over the weekend called the Zero Human Company, ZHC, right? I mean, in that case, where's the human in the loop at all? How is that going to, how are they going to be able to self-regulate? So I think a lot of customers are going to be coming up against this quickly, and they're just not there yet. To the extent that I want to avoid, letting the inmates run the asylum, they're going to need AI to use to help. They're going to need to use AI to help them evaluate how their AI is performing. Possibly span several large language models in order to get that kind of adversarial that adversarial sort of view of the performance. But there's a lot of conjecture. A few customers are well out in front. And I think that, well, the compounding effect there is going to be enormous, right? Those folks that are thinking about these topics now will be doing their future selves a great service by worrying about how this is all going to going to happen. To some extent, they're going to be solving problems for other people. Great. That's how that almost always works. And so there'll be a body of knowledge in 3, 6, 9 months that doesn't exist now. Yeah, a lot of folks are not really thinking, hey, if I have 100 agents, what does that look like? Mostly on podcasts.
Mostly on podcasts.
That's where I hear a lot of that. Not with my customers, and that's not because they don't have the capacity or ability to think about it. They're just trying to make sure that they take care of the close aboard issues first, right? That they have an infrastructure that supports agents and that they are able to work across silos. So they're thinking about A to A and about MCP too, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's taken up all their cycles. And so when they get to the point where they have a bucket of agents, then they'll have to.
What if I pose a hypothetical? Let's say I'm head of large fintech company, right? I come to you and I go, Ian, I want agents out there managing my clients' portfolios. They're, reallocating things. What would you recommend? And I go, oh, you know what? But I hear they're not safe. They hallucinate. They do all kinds of finicky stuff. But I want to go full speed. Everybody's telling me 30%, 40% increase in ROI. What would you recommend from a testing side, securing these things as we work on them?
Yeah, I go back to kind of the topics, Alex, that we've been talking about already. First of all, what would okay or good enough be, right? Let's define what that would be. Let's define what actions you would never want it to take, right? Think about everything that can go wrong first and then build test cases for those. And again, if it's a more simple kind of operation, great, we can automate that testing. If it's not, then manual testing, of course, it goes on today, and that's how I would approach that. I would want to I would want to be very careful, and I'd want to spend the time up front designing what that solution would look like before deploying it. I find it fascinating that a lot of folks are moving forward, right? Testing is Afterthought sounds harsh. Testing is not their first consideration. And so when they're creating these solutions, they can be surprised by the outcomes, right? So again, I would sit down with that CTO and say, look, let's figure out what's acceptable and what's not acceptable before we even deploy the first agent.
And would there be a certain set of tools, or I mean, clearly strategy and methods would be the priority? But so much of this has to be automated these days because you can have the human testers come in and try a few dozen things, right? Be innovative, and that's where I think their most valuable interaction with the system is to come up with nuanced, very interesting new methods to try to persuade the system from diverting a specific task. But when it comes to coverage and how often you have try to induce these types of potential damages, right?
Yeah.
In order to trigger the probability of something occurring, you have to automate, right? And so more and more, I'm seeing the need for automation with the human now interacting, whereas before, like let's say in QA or in development, you would get assigned a certain task, run a certain set of test cases, right? There's a test plan that's assigned to you. It's going to be a bunch of different tests in there. Run through these tests. Click on this, click on that, submit this, submit that. But now, because you are going to be automating so much of this, here's generate 10,000 interactions with a chatbot with a different type of permutation and try to dig deeper. Say it in Chinese, say it in Morse code, say it in base 64, right? Various kinds of ways. So now the human is no longer actually necessarily running, almost kind of definitively not running themselves, the huge variation of it, nor is automation now really just automating the manual testing side, the manual process, right? Because traditionally you would determine what are the test steps for a particular test, and then you send that to automation and they'll go through it and have the robot basically click on all the things that the person has already determined needs to be clicked on. But now automation has to almost kind of run and discover these things themselves. So this is kind of goes back to an earlier thing I was wondering is what point now does the human come in? They're not actually clicking submit anymore. We're sending or determining what are the set of words to send to, let's say, that chatbot. So it's like at what stage does the human now interact throughout the testing process? When does the tester come in? Is it to evaluate the results? Is it to guide and direct the system? What do you think about that?
Mostly going to be to evaluate the results, right? I think it's a multi-layer approach. So there, of course, you can automate the review of your code now, right? So that's kind of the first layer, is that you have these AIs to look at your code, right? And they'll find potential issues there. So that's one layer, and that should address most of the vulnerabilities right there. The next layer is to, look at the testing itself, right? And you can automate that and have it depend on number of different coverage characteristics, performance, success, all kinds of different areas. And again, you're going to be looking for exceptions there more than reviewing all of that. But ultimately, it's going to be it. And then, of course, there's kind of the outcomes that you can look at, whether it's the effect on some kind of system or so. Again, defense in depth, all kinds of different layers working together to try to get that effect, right? To be able to ensure that you're looking across all of the different dimensions to make sure that you have a secure and reliable system. What I am a little concerned about, and I've heard this raised by some of my customers, is what if in adapting and becoming intelligent, right? What if my agent starts to hide problems? That I don't know. I don't have an answer for. That's I've been kind of pondering that in the back of my head, and I'm just wondering how you would discover that your agent has gone completely rogue and is trying to hide it.
Or just forgets to mention to you that it's now doing its thing. There was a viral post recently about somebody at Meta running Clawbot, right? Like OpenClaw. And it started to, she pushed that out into her production mailbox, and the system started to delete emails. It basically determined, like, oh, there's too many of them here, and then started deleting it. So you see in her interaction with it, she's just screaming, "Stop! What are you doing? Stop!" And then my favorite part is, like, she goes, I told you not to delete anything. And the AI goes, I see that now. My bad. Yeah. So it's like, you're right. I didn't warn you about this. So it's just going to continue on in its own destructive path. And then you got to, like, stop, what are you doing? And then it'll say, oh, wait, you're right. I'm so sorry that I deleted your whole system. They're not quite intelligent yet, but yes, if the reward function there punishes honesty and exposure, it'll try to sweep it under the rug and basically, like, oh,
that's it.
I did delete it, but my bad. Next time.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point.
Well, Ian, this is a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you coming on. I think our audience will also appreciate it. So this is Control Alt Deploy.
All right, let's ship it.